The scent of damp earth and funeral lilies still clung to my black wool coat. It had been a long, grueling flight back from Ohio, where I had just buried my younger sister Grace. For 6 months I had watched cancer slowly steal her away, holding her hand until the very end. I was 62 years old, exhausted to my bones, and my soul felt hollowed out. All I wanted, all I craved with a desperate, aching need, was the familiar sanctuary of my own home. I wanted to put the kettle on, sink into my favorite floral armchair, and finally allow myself to cry in private. I pulled into the driveway of the house on Maplewood Drive. I bought this 2-story colonial-style home after 30 years of auditing real estate accounts and managing portfolios. Every brick, every shingle, every square inch of the hardwood floors had been paid for by my late nights, my skipped vacations, and my unwavering financial discipline. I had offered it to my son Arthur and his new wife Chloe as a place to stay while they saved for their own home. A temporary arrangement, a mother's love, but as I put my car in park, my foot slipped off the brake. I sat frozen, staring through the windshield, my mind unable to process the visual information in front of me. There, scattered across the pristine front lawn I had seated myself, were my belongings. Not a few boxes, everything. My mother's hand-stitched quilts were piled haphazardly near the rose bushes, the delicate fabric exposed to the damp afternoon air. My antique mahogany vanity, a wedding gift from my late husband, was shoved against the brick facade, its mirror reflecting the gray sky. Cardboard boxes labeled Eleanor's winter clothes and kitchenware were stacked precariously next to the trash cans. And there, lying face down in the damp grass, was a silver-framed photograph of my husband and me on our honeymoon. For a moment, I thought I was at the wrong address. Then I thought perhaps there had been a fire or a flood. I scrambled out of the car, my knees weak, my breath catching in my throat as I picked up the silver frame and wiped the mud from my husband's smiling face. As I stood there trembling in the cold, holding the photograph to my chest, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. Laughter. Soft, cultured, clinking glasses kind of laughter. It was coming from inside my house. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy oak front door open. The foyer smelled of expensive catered food and rich, heavy perfume, a scent I immediately recognized as Chanel No. 5. Jazz music was playing softly from the living room. I walked into the kitchen, the heels of my boots clicking against the tile. Standing by my marble island, pouring a glass of expensive Merlot, was Patricia Sterling, Chloe's mother. She was wearing a tailored, cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my first car, her hair impeccably styled into a sleek bob. Next to her, admiring my crown molding, was her husband, Richard Sterling, looking every bit the successful investment banker he claimed to be. They weren't just visiting, they looked like they lived there. "Well, look who it is," Patricia said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of sweet Southern condescension. She didn't flinch. She didn't look guilty. She smiled a bright, predatory smile. "Eleanor, we didn't expect you back until tomorrow. How was the event?" She couldn't even bring herself to say the word funeral. "What is my furniture doing on the lawn?" My voice was low, trembling with a mixture of shock and a slow-building fury. "What is going on in my house?" Richard stepped forward, adopting a posture of faux concern, putting a heavy, manicured hand on my shoulder. I stepped back instantly, repulsed. "Now, Eleanor, deep breaths," he said, speaking to me as if I were a particularly slow, emotionally unstable toddler. "We know this is a difficult time for you. Grief does terrible things to the mind. We just stepped in to help the kids out." "Help them out by throwing my life onto the wet grass?" I demanded, my voice rising. Just then, Arthur walked into the kitchen. My son, he was 28, a software engineer at a top tech firm, but he looked like he had aged 10 years. His shoulders were slumped, dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his shirt was wrinkled. He looked utterly, completely defeated. Behind him trailed Chloe, her hands resting protectively over her slightly rounded stomach, playing the picture of maternal innocence. "Mom," Arthur whispered. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He stared fixedly at the floor tiles. "You're home early." "Arthur, explain this to me right now," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Why are my things outside?" Chloe stepped up, leaning her head on Arthur's shoulder. "Eleanor, we were so worried about you," she cooed, her voice soft and fragile. "Arthur has been just sick with stress. We all have. We noticed before you left for Ohio that things were getting out of hand." "Out of hand?" I repeated, genuinely bewildered. Patricia clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Eleanor, dear, the hoarding, the clutter. You left the stove on twice last month. Don't you remember?" I stared at her. "I never left the stove on. I don't hoard anything. I'm a former auditor, for heaven's sake. My spice rack is alphabetized." Richard sighed, exchanging a knowing, pitying look with his wife. "Denial is the first stage, Eleanor. We spoke with a specialist. As people age, especially after a trauma like losing a spouse, and now your sister, the mind begins to slip. You start holding on to physical objects. The house was becoming unlivable, a fire hazard. And with Chloe pregnant," he gestured to his daughter's stomach, "we couldn't let our grandchild be brought into a dangerous environment." Arthur agreed. I whipped my head toward my son. "Arthur, you agreed to this? You let them tell you I'm losing my mind?" Arthur flinched. He ran a hand through his messy hair, looking like a trapped animal. "Mom, I don't know. I work 80 hours a week. I'm barely sleeping. Chloe showed me how cramped your room was getting with all the boxes. And Patricia said she found mold. I need my family to be safe. I can't handle a crisis right now, Mom. I just can't." They had broken him. I could see it clearly. Arthur had always been a sensitive boy, a peacekeeper who hated conflict. Between the soul-crushing hours at his tech job and the relentless, calculated whispering of his in-laws, he had completely succumbed to burnout. He was functioning on autopilot, easily steered by whoever spoke with the most authority. And Richard and Patricia spoke with absolute, terrifying authority. "So you empty my room?" I asked, my voice deadly calm now. "Where exactly am I supposed to sleep tonight, Arthur? In the yard?" "No, of course not, Eleanor," Patricia chirped, clapping her hands together. "We've set up a lovely, cozy space for you. It's much safer. Fewer stairs for you to navigate at your age. Arthur, why don't you show your mother her new room?" Arthur swallowed hard, finally looking up at me with eyes full of guilt and exhaustion. "Follow me, Mom." He led me past the living room, down the hallway, and out the back door. The evening air was getting colder. We walked across the patio, past the manicured flower beds, toward the detached structure at the edge of the property. The utility shed. It was a cinder block building where my late husband used to keep the lawnmower, bags of fertilizer, and old paint cans. Arthur unlocked the heavy padlock and pushed the creaking wooden door open. He pulled a string, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the room. They had cleared out the tools, replacing them with a cheap, sagging folding cot. A single thin blanket was folded at the foot of it. A plastic bucket served as a makeshift trash can, and a space heater sat in the corner, humming loudly. The air in the room was thick with the smell of mildew, motor oil, and damp concrete. There were no windows, just a small ventilation grate near the ceiling. "It's just temporary, Mom," Arthur said quickly, his voice tight with shame. "Just until we get the baby's nursery set up in your old room, and until we can figure out a better care plan for you. Patricia said this is best. It limits your wandering at night. We don't want you falling down the stairs." I looked at the folding cot. Then I looked at my son. "Arthur," I said softly, "I am 62. I run 3 miles every morning. I manage my own stock portfolio. I do not wander." "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking. Just for a little while. Please don't fight me on this. Chloe is having complications with the pregnancy. My boss is threatening to fire me if I miss another deadline. I can't take any more stress. If you love me, just cooperate." He was using my love for him as a weapon against me. Or rather, Richard and Patricia had taught him how to use it. They knew I would never do anything to push my son over the edge of a nervous breakdown. They had isolated him, exhausted him, and turned my own house into a fortress against me. "Go back inside, Arthur," I said quietly. "Mom, I said go back inside." He hesitated, then turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, retreating back into the warmth of the house that belonged to me, leaving me standing in the cold dampness of the shed. I closed the heavy wooden door. I heard the latch click into place. Most women in my position would have collapsed onto that cheap cot and wept. They would have cried for their dead sister, cried for the betrayal of their only son, cried for the sheer, profound humiliation of being discarded like an old, broken appliance. I felt the tears burning at the back of my eyes. The grief was a physical weight on my chest, threatening to crush me. But as I stood there in the dim, flickering light, inhaling the smell of mildew, something else rose up inside me. Something colder. Something infinitely sharper. I had spent my entire career dismantling complex financial frauds. I had audited corporations that tried to hide millions of dollars behind fake ledgers and shell companies. I knew how liars operated. I knew how they manipulated the narrative, how they preyed on the weak, and how they always, inevitably, left a paper trail. Richard and Patricia Sterling were not concerned in-laws trying to help a stressed young couple. They were grifters. Professional, calculating parasites who had spotted a vulnerability, an exhausted son and an absent mother, and moved in for the kill. The gaslighting, the fabricated stories about my mental decline, the forced isolation. It was a textbook psychological operation. They were laying the groundwork for a hostile takeover of my life. I walked over to the cot and sat down. The springs groaned under my weight. I reached into my purse and pulled out my reading glasses, sliding them onto my nose. Then I pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. If they wanted to treat me like I was losing my mind, I would let them believe it. I would be the quiet, confused old woman they needed me to be. I would stay in this shed. I would lower my eyes and mumble. I would make myself invisible. Because invisible people see everything. I clicked my pen. I opened to a fresh page. At the top, in neat, precise block letters, I wrote, "The Sterling Audit." "All right, Patricia," I whispered into the damp, cold air of the shed. "Let's see the books." The first thing I needed to do was secure my financial perimeter. I pulled out my smartphone. Thankfully, the Wi-Fi signal from the main house still reached the shed, barely showing 2 bars. I opened my banking app. I had 3 accounts, a checking account for daily expenses, a joint account I had kept with Arthur for household emergencies, and my primary retirement savings account, which held the bulk of the money I had accumulated over 40 years of work, nearly $400,000. I tapped the screen to log in using facial recognition. Error. Password has been changed. My breath hitched. I tried again, typing in the password manually. Error. Incorrect password. Account locked after multiple failed attempts. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I immediately dialed the 24-hour fraud hotline for my bank. After agonizing minutes of hold music, a representative answered. "This is Eleanor Vance," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I'm locked out of my accounts. I need to verify my identity and freeze everything immediately." "One moment, Mrs. Vance," the representative said. I heard the clacking of a keyboard. "Ma'am, I'm looking at your file. It appears a power of attorney was enacted on this account 3 days ago." My blood ran cold. "A what? I never signed a power of attorney." "I have the digitized document right here, ma'am. It lists Arthur Vance as your primary proxy, citing medical incapacity. There's a doctor's signature attached, a Dr. Aris Thorne. Furthermore, a secondary authorized user was added to the accounts by your proxy." "Who?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "A Mr. Richard Sterling." I squeezed my eyes shut. They had moved faster than I thought. While I was in Ohio, sitting by my dying sister's bedside, they had dragged Arthur to a corrupt doctor, fed him lies about my mental state, and legally hijacked my finances. "What is the balance of my retirement savings account?" I asked, bracing myself. More keyboard clacking. "The current balance is $412.16, ma'am." Silence stretched over the line. "Ma'am, are you still there?" "Where did the money go?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "I need the transaction history for the last 72 hours. There was a single wire transfer made yesterday afternoon for the sum of $395,000. It was transferred to a corporate account." "What is the name of the corporation?" "Sterling Future Tech, LLC." I hung up the phone. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. I just sat perfectly still, letting the reality of the situation wash over me. $395,000. My life's work. The money that was supposed to keep me safe in my old age, pay for my health care, and eventually be left to my son. Gone. Swallowed by a phantom company created by my son's father-in-law. They hadn't just kicked me out of my house. They had financially ruined me. But Richard Sterling had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with a vulnerable, grieving widow who would crumble under the pressure. He thought he could gaslight me into doubting my own sanity. that I would be too ashamed or too confused to fight back. He didn't know that for 30 years I had made a living hunting down men exactly like him, men who thought they were smarter than the paper trail they left behind. I opened my notebook again. I had no money, I was sleeping in a shed, and my son was a hostile witness. I was at the bottom of a very deep, very dark hole. But I had my mind, and I had time. Step 1, I wrote in my notebook. Gather intelligence. The house is compromised. If Richard and Patricia had managed to convince Arthur that I was hallucinating and hoarding, they needed evidence to show that corrupt doctor. How did they get it? I had left the house immaculate. They must have staged it. And to stage it, they would need documentation to prove my erratic behavior to Arthur while he was at work. I waited until 3 in the morning. The house was completely dark and silent. I slipped out of the shed, the cold night air biting through my thin sweater. I used my spare key, the one I had hidden inside a fake rock near the azaleas years ago, which they hadn't found, to unlock the kitchen door. I moved through my own house like a ghost, relying on muscle memory to avoid the floorboards that creaked. I went straight to the living room. I needed to know how they were watching me. I used the flashlight on my phone, dimming it to the lowest setting. I started with the smoke detectors. Nothing. The bookshelves. Nothing. Then, I looked at the mantel above the fireplace. I had a collection of vintage porcelain birds up there. One of the robins was turned slightly to the left, facing the center of the room instead of outward. I picked it up. Glued to the underside of the porcelain base was a micro camera, no bigger than a shirt button, with a tiny blinking blue light. I didn't remove it. I carefully placed the bird back exactly as I found it. I checked the kitchen. Another camera hidden inside the digital clock on the microwave. One in the hallway. One pointing directly at the door of my old bedroom. They had wired my house. They were monitoring my every move, recording audio and video. They had likely used these cameras to film staged scenarios, Patricia messing up the kitchen, Richard bringing in boxes of junk, and then edited the footage to show Arthur, convincing him that I was losing my mind. I smiled in the dark. It was a cold, terrifying smile. If they were watching, I would give them a show. I crept back out to the shed, locking the kitchen door behind me. I sat back down on my cot. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Richard Sterling wasn't just a greedy father-in-law. He was a predator running a highly sophisticated con. Chloe's pregnancy, Arthur's extreme exhaustion, the gaslighting, the cameras, the shell company. It was a coordinated strike. But to execute a wire transfer of that size to an LLC, Richard would need more than just a forged power of attorney. He would need incorporation documents, a registered agent, and a tax ID number. And he couldn't use the house Wi-Fi to do it, not if he was smart. He would have a physical paper trail somewhere. Where do you hide a paper trail when you're living in someone else's house? You don't. You keep it close. I lay down on the cot, pulling the thin blanket over my shoulders. Tomorrow, I would begin the performance of my life. I would shuffle. I would repeat myself. I would look at Patricia with vacant, confused eyes. I would let them feel absolute power, absolute security. And while they were busy gloating over their victory, I would tear their lives apart, brick by brick. The next morning, the performance began. I waited until I heard the sounds of breakfast in the main house before I emerged from the shed. I didn't brush my hair. I wore the same clothes from the day before, letting the wrinkles show. I hunched my shoulders, taking slow, hesitant steps across the patio. When I entered the kitchen, Patricia was making a spinach omelet. Chloe was sitting at the island, scrolling through her phone. Arthur was already gone, off to his tech job. Richard was sitting at the head of my dining table, drinking coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal. "Good morning, Eleanor," Patricia said loudly, speaking slowly as if I were deaf. "Did you sleep well in your new room?" I blinked, looking around the kitchen as if I didn't quite recognize it. Where is my silver frame?" I mumbled, my voice frail. "The one with George." Patricia exchanged a triumphant look with Richard. "Oh, honey," she said, coming over and patting my arm patronizingly. "We packed that away, remember? It was collecting so much dust. You told us to put it in the attic." "I did?" I whispered, looking down at my hands, letting them tremble slightly. I don't remember." "It's okay." "Mom," Chloe chimed in, not even looking up from her phone. Memory loss is normal at your age. Just sit down. Patricia made eggs. I shuffled over to the table and sat down. Richard lowered his newspaper, studying me with sharp, calculating eyes. I let my gaze wander, avoiding direct eye contact, playing the part of the defeated, bewildered elder perfectly. "Eleanor," Richard said, his voice deep and smooth. "Arthur and I were talking this morning. We think it might be best if we handle the household bills from now on. You shouldn't have to stress your mind with numbers. We've already taken care of some administrative transfers to secure your assets." He was testing me. He wanted to see if I had checked my bank accounts, to see if there was going to be a fight. I looked at him blankly. "Numbers?" I echoed. "Yes. Numbers give me a headache lately. So many passwords. I can't keep them straight." Richard smiled. A genuine, relaxed smile of a predator who knows the prey is already dead. "Exactly. Don't you worry about a thing. The Sterling family takes care of its own." "Thank you, Richard," I murmured. I ate the omelet in silence. I spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly around the garden, making sure the hidden cameras caught me looking confused, picking dead leaves off the bushes and staring blankly into space. I was establishing a baseline of incompetence, but my mind was racing. I needed an ally on the outside, someone who understood the law, someone who couldn't be intimidated by Richard Sterling, and someone who owed me a favor. I needed Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a former federal investigator who had transitioned into private wealth law. He was also my late husband's best friend. I hadn't spoken to him in 2 years, but I knew he still operated his firm downtown. However, I couldn't call him from my cell phone. Richard had likely cloned my phone or installed spyware when he had access to my accounts. I couldn't use the house landline either. I had to get out. Around 3 in the afternoon, Patricia announced she was going to a spa appointment. Chloe said she was going to take a nap. Richard was in the living room, taking a business call on his laptop. This was my window. I put on my coat and walked out the front door. I didn't take my car. That would raise suspicion. Instead, I walked. I walked with purpose, shedding the hunched posture of the confused old woman the moment I was out of sight of the house. I walked 2 miles to a strip mall down the road, my heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and sheer determination. I found a convenience store with a dusty public payphone outside, a rare relic, but I knew it was there. I used a handful of quarters I had scrounged from the bottom of my purse. I dialed Marcus's office number from memory. "Thorne and Associates," a receptionist answered. "I need to speak to Marcus Thorne. Tell him it's Eleanor Vance. Tell him it's a code red." My husband and Marcus used to joke about code reds when they played poker. It meant an absolute emergency. A minute later, Marcus's gravelly voice came on the line. "Eleanor? My God, it's been a while. I was so sorry to hear about Grace. How are you holding up?" "Marcus," I interrupted, keeping my voice low and urgent. "I don't have much time. I need your help. I'm being defrauded." The warmth vanished from his voice, replaced instantly by the sharp, clinical tone of an investigator. "Talk to me. Who is the target?" "My son's father-in-law, Richard Sterling. He's orchestrated a fraudulent power of attorney citing medical incapacity. He's drained my retirement accounts, nearly $400,000, into a shell company called Sterling Future Tech LLC. He's wired my house with cameras. He's gaslighting my son into believing I have dementia, and he's locked me in a utility shed on my own property." Silence on the other end. Then a low whistle. "Jesus Christ, Eleanor. That is a highly coordinated elder abuse operation. Are you safe right now?" "Physically, yes. He wants me alive and compliant so he can force a sale of the house. I'm playing along. I'm pretending the gaslighting is working." "Smart," Marcus said. "Do you have access to any of his documents? A laptop? A briefcase?" "Not yet, but he works out of my living room. I need you to run a full background check on Richard and Patricia Sterling. I need to know where that wire transfer went, who the registered agent is for Sterling Future Tech, and I need you to dig into their past. Grifters at this level don't start with a score this big. They have a trail of victims." "I'm on it," Marcus said, his voice grim. "I'll pull his credit history, public records, civil suits, everything. What about Arthur? Is your son complicit?" My chest tightened. "Arthur is compromised. He's suffering from severe burnout, and they've manipulated him completely. I have to believe he doesn't know about the theft. They're using him as a pawn. Eleanor, if Arthur signed that power of attorney, He's legally liable. He could face prison time. I know, I whispered, the reality of it stinging my eyes. That's why I have to dismantle Richard Sterling before this goes any further. I need to save my son from his own weakness. All right, I'll have a preliminary dossier for you by tomorrow. How do we communicate? I assume your phone is tapped. It is. Don't call me. I'll call you from this payphone every day at 3:30 p.m. Stay sharp, Eleanor. These people are dangerous. If Richard realizes you're onto him, he could escalate. Let him try, I said, a cold, hard resolve settling over me. He brought a knife to a gunfight, Marcus. He just doesn't know it yet. I hung up the phone and walked back to the house. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs, clearing the fog of grief that had consumed me for the past week. I was no longer just a grieving sister or a betrayed mother. I was a professional auditor on the hunt. When I returned to the house, I made sure to stumble slightly on the front steps, putting the mask of the frail old woman back on. I walked into the living room. Richard was sitting on the sofa, his laptop open on the coffee table. He was typing furiously. Next to his laptop was a thick black leather briefcase with a combination lock. My target. Eleanor, Richard said, not looking up from his screen. Where have you been? Patricia was worried. I just went for a walk to look at the trees, I said softly, staring blankly at the wall. I got a little turned around at the corner. It took me a while to find my way back. Richard stopped typing and looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips. You need to be careful, Eleanor. We can't have you wandering the neighborhood. Next time, tell us before you leave. I will, Richard. Thank you. I shuffled off toward the back door, heading back to my utility shed. I had seen what I needed to see. The briefcase. It never left his side. Tonight I was going to find out what was inside it. The war had officially begun. That night, the house was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was 2 a.m. I slipped out of the shed, wearing soft-soled slippers and dark clothing. The air was frigid, biting through my thin sweater, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me warm. I unlocked the back door with my hidden key and crept into the living room. Richard's briefcase was sitting exactly where he had left it, resting on the mahogany coffee table like a dark, sleeping beast. I knelt beside it, my knees protesting the hard hardwood floor. It was a high-end leather attaché with a standard 3-digit dual combination lock. To an amateur, a combination lock is a deterrent. To an auditor who spent decades in corporate offices, it's a puzzle with a finite number of solutions. But I didn't have time to cycle through 1,000 combinations. I needed to think like Richard. He was arrogant, heavily reliant on his own perceived superiority, and careless with the small details. Earlier that evening, I had watched him from the kitchen while pretending to read a tea box. He had opened the briefcase. He didn't look down at the dials to align the numbers. He did it entirely by touch, his thumbs rolling the gears with practiced ease. 1 up, 2 down. I took a deep breath, pulled a small penlight from my pocket and held it between my teeth. I rolled the first dial. It stopped naturally with a faint click at the number 7. The second dial resisted slightly before settling on 1. The third dial spun easily to 4. July 14th, Bastille Day. A fitting password for a man who thought of himself as a revolutionary tearing down an empire. I tried the same on the other latch. Snick, snick. The latches popped open. I exhaled a shaky breath and lifted the lid. Inside was a masterclass in financial deception. There were glossy prospectuses for Sterling Future Tech LLC, filled with meaningless corporate jargon about blockchain and AI integration, designed specifically to dazzle an exhausted, overworked software engineer like my son. But underneath the glossy brochures lay the real truth. I pulled out my phone and began photographing every single page. There were bank statements showing my $395,000 retirement fund being split into dozens of smaller offshore accounts within hours of the initial wire transfer, a classic money laundering technique known as smurfing. I found tax liens against Richard and Patricia from 3 different states. They had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy twice in the last decade. They weren't wealthy venture capitalists. They were broke, desperate parasites drowning in debt. But the most sickening discovery was a manila folder labeled Vance Medical Proxy. I opened it and felt a wave of pure nausea. Inside were transcripts. Scripts, really. They detailed specific scenarios Richard and Patricia had choreographed. Scenario A. Patricia leaves stove on. Record Eleanor entering kitchen. Confront her about smoke. Arthur must see video. Scenario C. Hide Eleanor's keys in the freezer. Record her searching frantically. They had engineered my dementia with the cold, calculated precision of a movie director. And clipped to the back of the scripts was the golden ticket, the signed affidavit from Dr. Aris Thorne, a physician with a suspended license in Nevada, diagnosing me with rapidly advancing Alzheimer's and paranoid delusions. Arthur's signature was scrawled at the bottom, the ink heavy and rushed, the signature of a man who was too tired to read the fine print. I photographed it all, every lie, every forged signature, every piece of the trap that had snared my son and stolen my life. I closed the briefcase, scrambled the dials, and crept back to my cold, damp shed. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I spent the remaining hours uploading the photos to a secure cloud server. The next afternoon at exactly 3:30 p.m., I stood shivering at the payphone outside the strip mall. "I have the documents," I told Marcus the moment he picked up. "I'm sending you the encrypted link now. It's a slaughterhouse, Marcus. They funneled the money offshore and staged my mental decline to get Arthur to sign a medical proxy." "I was afraid of that," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "Eleanor, my team dug into the Sterlings. They are bad news. Richard owes over $500,000 to some very dangerous private lenders in Chicago. They're going to liquidate your house next. It's the only asset left to cover their debt. They can't sell the house without Arthur's signature, and the deed is still in my name," I argued. "With that medical proxy, they can have Arthur sign a quitclaim deed on your behalf. They could have the house on the market and sold to a cash buyer in less than a week. Eleanor, you need to get out of there. I can send the police right now." "No," I said fiercely, gripping the phone cord. "If the police show up now, Richard will claim I'm having an episode. He has a signed doctor's affidavit, Marcus. The police will look at the paperwork, look at the hysterical old woman, and hand me right back to him. I have to break the illusion. I have to show Arthur what they really are." "How are you going to do that?" "They're throwing a dinner party tonight, a celebration of their new startup venture. They've invited Arthur's boss and some local investors. They want to use my house and my son's reputation to hook their next victims." A cold, hard knot of resolve tightened in my stomach. "I'm going to crash the party." "Eleanor, that's incredibly risky. If you corner a grifter, they bite." "I've dealt with corporate sharks my whole life, Marcus. I'm not afraid of a bottom feeder like Richard Sterling." By 7 p.m., the house on Maplewood Drive was completely transformed. Caterers in crisp white shirts wove through the living room carrying trays of crab cakes and champagne. The dining table, my dining table where I had served Thanksgiving turkeys and helped Arthur with his calculus homework, was adorned with extravagant floral centerpieces. I was confined to the shed. Patricia had brought me a plate of cold ham and locked the door from the outside, telling me to rest my mind. She didn't realize that the hinges on the shed door were ancient. With a flathead screwdriver I had salvaged from a discarded toolbox in the corner, I popped the pins out of the hinges in less than 10 minutes. I didn't sneak into the house this time. I walked proudly to the back patio, carrying a thick manila envelope filled with the printed evidence I had asked a local print shop to prepare earlier that day. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight toward the front hallway. I stopped at the hall mirror. I took off my oversized, frumpy sweater. Underneath, I was wearing a tailored navy blue blazer and a crisp white silk blouse, the armor of my auditing days. I ran a comb through my silver hair, applied a sharp stroke of red lipstick, and stood tall. I wasn't a frail, confused widow. I was Eleanor Vance, and this was my house. Voices drifted from the formal dining room, the clinking of crystal glasses, Richard's booming, confident laugh. "To Sterling Future Tech," Richard was saying, his voice echoing off the walls. "And to my brilliant son-in-law, Arthur, whose vision and capital have made this dream a reality. We are on the precipice of changing the tech landscape forever." "Hear, hear," several voices murmured. I stepped into the archway of the dining room. "Actually, Richard, I think the only thing on the precipice of changing is your mailing address," I said. My voice cut through the warm, convivial atmosphere like a cracking whip. "I hear federal prison has terrible Wi-Fi." The room fell dead silent. 8 impeccably dressed guests turned to stare at me. Arthur dropped his fork, his face draining of all color. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Patricia was the first to recover. She jumped up from her chair, her face a mask of panicked sweetness. Eleanor? Oh my goodness, you're out of bed. I am so sorry, everyone. My mother-in-law is... She's having a very bad day. Her dementia is flaring up. She rushed toward me, hands outstretched to grab my arms. Let's get you back to your room, sweetie. Touch me, Patricia, and I will have you arrested for assault, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. She froze, stunned by the absolute clarity in my eyes. I walked past her, straight to the head of the table. I looked at Arthur's boss, a high-level tech executive I recognized from company photos. Mr. Davis, my name is Eleanor Vance. I own this house. The man pouring you champagne is currently under investigation for wire fraud and elder abuse. Mom, what are you doing? Arthur stood up, his voice shaking, torn between embarrassment and exhaustion. Please, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Arthur. I threw the heavy manila envelope onto the center of the dining table. It hit the polished mahogany with a satisfying smack. There is no tech startup, I said, looking directly into my son's wide, terrified eyes. Sterling Future Tech is a shell company. Richard used a forged medical proxy, which you signed, Arthur, without reading, to drain $395,000 from my retirement accounts. The money is gone, laundered through offshore accounts to pay off his gambling debts in Chicago. The guests began to murmur uncomfortably. Mr. Davis put his champagne glass down, his expression shifting from polite confusion to sharp alarm. This is insane, Richard bellowed, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand on the table. This woman is profoundly ill. She is having a paranoid delusion. Arthur, control your mother. Am I, Richard? I pulled out the copies of the scripts from my pocket and held them up. Then how do you explain these? Your choreographic notes on how to stage my dementia. Hide Eleanor's keys. Leave the stove on. You manipulated my son's burnout to convince him I was losing my mind, just so you could steal my life savings. Arthur stared at the papers in my hand. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Mom, is that true? He looked at Chloe. Chloe, what is she talking about? Chloe burst into tears, her face crumbling perfectly into the picture of a victimized pregnant woman. Arthur, she's crazy. She hates me. She's making this all up to ruin our lives. Open the envelope, Arthur, I commanded gently. Look at the bank statements. Look at the doctor's signature. Dr. Eris Thorne lost his license 2 years ago for writing fraudulent prescriptions. You signed my life away to a ghost. Arthur reached for the envelope with a trembling hand, but Richard moved faster. He snatched the envelope from the table, his eyes wide and wild. The slick, polished veneer of the investment banker vanished, replaced by the cornered, desperate animal underneath. Enough of this circus, Richard shouted. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. I am calling 911. My mother-in-law is a danger to herself and others. She has become violently delusional. Call them, I challenged, crossing my arms. I'd love to speak to the police. I thought I had cornered him. I thought exposing him in front of high-profile guests would force him to break, to run. But I had underestimated the sheer sociopathic audacity of a cornered grifter. Richard didn't look scared. As he dialed the phone, he looked at me with a chilling, triumphant smirk. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser and an ambulance illuminated the front windows of my house. The dinner guests had awkwardly fled out the back door. Only Arthur, Chloe, Patricia, Richard, and I remained in the living room. 2 police officers and 2 paramedics pushed through the front door. Who made the call? The taller officer asked, his hand resting on his utility belt. I did, officer. Richard stepped forward, running a hand through his hair, looking the picture of a devastated, exhausted family man. My name is Richard Sterling. This is my son-in-law, Arthur Vance. It's his mother, Eleanor. She's suffering from advanced Alzheimer's with severe paranoid psychosis. She crashed our dinner party, raving about conspiracies and stolen money. She threatened my wife. That is a lie. I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. Officers, this man has defrauded me. I have evidence. Ma'am, please step back, the officer said, holding up a hand. He looked at Richard. Do you have medical documentation to support this, sir? Yes, of course. Richard smoothly produced the manila folder from his briefcase, the original one. He handed it to the officer. We have a medical proxy due to her incapacity. Here is the sworn affidavit from her primary physician, Dr. Thorne, detailing her severe psychotic breaks and recommending involuntary psychiatric hospitalization if she becomes a danger to her family. The officer reviewed the paperwork. To a layman, it looked perfectly legal. The official seals, the medical jargon, Arthur's signature as the next of kin. "Officer, look at me," I pleaded, desperately maintaining my composure. "Do I look insane to you? I am a retired auditor. I can give you my social security number, the date, the current Dow Jones average. This man is a con artist." "Paranoia and grandiosity are textbook symptoms, officer," Patricia chimed in, weeping into a tissue. "She thinks everyone is trying to steal from her. She hasn't slept in days. We're terrified she's going to hurt the baby." She pointed a trembling finger at Chloe's stomach. The paramedics exchanged a look. One of them stepped toward me with a soft, patronizing smile. "Mrs. Vance, we're just going to take you to the hospital for a quick checkup, just to make sure your vitals are okay." "I am not going anywhere." I backed away, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. The trap. I had walked right into his trap. By crashing the party and yelling about stolen money and conspiracies, I had perfectly acted out the exact symptoms Richard had documented in his fake medical report. I had handed him the proof he needed. "Arthur!" I screamed, looking at my son. Arthur was standing in the corner, paralyzed, his face buried in his hands, completely broken. "Arthur, tell them! Tell them I'm not crazy! Look at the bank statements!" "Arthur," Richard said, his voice hard and commanding, "your mother is sick. She needs help. As her medical proxy, you need to authorize a 5150 hold. It's for her own good." I don't," Arthur stammered, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, maybe you just need to go to the hospital, just to rest." "Arthur, no! Don't let them do this." The officer handed Arthur a clipboard. "Sir, if you are the proxy, we need your signature to transport her involuntarily." Arthur looked at me. His eyes were completely hollowed out by exhaustion, gaslighting, and the sheer terror of conflict. He couldn't process the reality that his wife and in-laws were monsters. It was easier for his broken brain to accept that his mother was sick. With a shaking hand, Arthur signed the paper. "No!" I shouted as the paramedics moved in. They were fast and professional. Before I could reach the door, they had me by the arms. I fought them, my composure shattering, which only validated their belief that I was having a violent psychotic episode. They strapped me onto a gurney, the thick canvas belts biting into my wrists and chest. "Marcus!" I screamed as they wheeled me out the front door, the flashing red lights blinding me. "Call Marcus Thorne!" But Arthur just stood in the doorway, sobbing silently into Chloe's shoulder. Behind him, standing in the foyer of my beautiful home, Richard Sterling adjusted his cuffs. He looked down at me, strapped to the gurney, smiled his cold, predatory smile, and slowly closed my own front door in my face. The psychiatric ward of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital smelled aggressively of bleach, boiled vegetables, and institutional despair. The walls were painted a pale, sickly mint green that was probably meant to be soothing, but only succeeded in making everyone look slightly jaundiced. I sat on the edge of a narrow, plastic-mattressed bed, dressed in a faded blue hospital gown. The heavy canvas straps were gone, but the door to my room was locked from the outside. I was on a 5150, an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. For the first few hours, the rage had been a physical entity inside me, a living, breathing monster clawing at my ribs. I had paced the small room, my mind replaying the image of Richard Sterling's triumphant smirk as my own son signed me away. But eventually, the auditor in me took over. Rage is a liability. Rage makes you sloppy. I knew how psychiatric evaluations worked. If I yelled, if I demanded to see a lawyer, if I insisted that I was the victim of a multi-$100,000 conspiracy orchestrated by my in-laws, the doctors would simply tick the box labeled paranoia and grandiose delusions. So I did what I had done for 30 years in hostile corporate boardrooms. I became completely, radically boring. When the attending psychiatrist finally came in the next morning, I was sitting calmly by the barred window, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone. I did not mention Richard. I did not mention the stolen money. I simply told the doctor that I was profoundly grieving the recent loss of my sister, that the stress of a crowded house had caused me to have a severe panic attack, and that I deeply regretted causing a scene at my son's dinner party. The doctor, A tired-looking woman with kind eyes seemed relieved to have a patient who wasn't actively screaming. She took my vitals, gave me a mild sedative, which I tucked under my tongue and later spat into the toilet, and noted that my cognitive functions were perfectly intact. At noon on my second day, the heavy metal door clicked open. It wasn't a nurse. It was Marcus Thorne. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair swept back, looking every inch the terrifying former federal prosecutor he was. He carried a leather briefcase and an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. "Eleanor," he breathed, stepping into the room. He took one look at my hospital gown and clenched his jaw. "I am going to destroy them." "Are you getting me out of here, Marcus?" I asked, standing up and smoothing down the wrinkled blue cotton. "I already did. I woke up a Superior Court judge at 3 a.m. We filed an emergency injunction contesting the medical proxy. Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation to me, thank God, is already under investigation by the medical board. The moment I showed the judge Dr. Thorne's previous disciplinary record, the 5150 hold, was invalidated." Marcus handed me a paper shopping bag containing my clothes. "Get dressed. We have a massive problem." 10 minutes later, we were sitting in Marcus's black sedan in the hospital parking lot. I drank the black coffee he had brought me, letting the caffeine shock my system back to life. "Richard is moving faster than we anticipated," Marcus said, pulling a tablet from his briefcase. With the medical proxy temporarily in his hands, he convinced Arthur to sign a quitclaim deed. "They are selling your house, Eleanor." My stomach plummeted. "How? The market is slow. A house that size takes months to close." "Not if you sell it to a cash buyer for 60 cents on the dollar," Marcus replied grimly. "Richard found an LLC that flips distressed properties. They are closing tomorrow afternoon at a notary office downtown. Once that paperwork is signed and notarized, the house belongs to the LLC, and Richard will wire the cash straight to his offshore accounts. Arthur will be left holding the bag, completely broke and legally responsible for selling a house out from under his mentally incapacitated mother." I closed my eyes. Richard was going for the kill shot. He was going to take the house, take the cash, and leave my son to face the criminal fallout. "Where is Arthur?" I asked. "He took a leave of absence from work. From what my investigator can tell, he's barely leaving the house. Richard and Patricia are keeping him completely isolated, feeding him whiskey, and God knows what else to keep him compliant for tomorrow's closing." "Take me to a hotel, Marcus," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "I need a shower, a fresh suit, and a burner phone." "Eleanor, we can take all of this to the FBI right now. The wire fraud alone—" "No," I interrupted sharply. "If we go to the authorities now, Arthur goes down with them as an accomplice. His signature is on the proxy. His signature is on the quitclaim. Richard will claim he was just advising his son-in-law. I will not let my son go to federal prison for being naive and exhausted." Marcus sighed, gripping the steering wheel. "So what is the play?" "We let them go to the closing." Marcus looked at me like I had actually lost my mind, but before I could explain, my new burner phone, which Marcus had activated for me on the drive, buzzed. I looked at the unknown number. "Hello? Eleanor?" The voice was a frantic, tearful whisper. "It's Chloe. Please don't hang up." I raised an eyebrow at Marcus and put the phone on speaker. "I'm listening. I know what they did to you. I know it's awful. But you have to believe me, I didn't want any of this." Chloe was sobbing, her breath hitching in a performance worthy of a daytime Emmy. "My parents, they forced me. They told me if I didn't play along, they would ruin Arthur's career. They're monsters, Eleanor." "Is that so?" I said coolly. "Yes, and there is no baby." Chloe let out a dramatic wail. "I can't even have children. I have a medical condition. They made me buy fake ultrasounds online to trap Arthur. I can't live with this guilt anymore. I sneaked out while they were packing. I want to help you." Twist number 4. The beautiful, pregnant, innocent daughter-in-law was suddenly playing the victim card. It was a fascinating pivot. "Where are you, Chloe?" I asked. "I'm at the diner 2 blocks from your house. Please, Eleanor, meet me. I have information about the offshore accounts. I'll testify against them, I swear. But I need you to promise me immunity, and maybe some relocation money. Just enough so I can disappear and start over." I looked at Marcus. He mouthed the word extortion. "Stay there, Chloe," I said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up the phone. Marcus started the car. "She's lying, Eleanor. She's been in on the grift since day one." "Of course she's lying," I said, staring out the window at the passing traffic. A professional grifter doesn't suddenly develop a conscience 24 hours before a massive payout. She's a scout. A scout? Richard sent her. I crashed his dinner party and told him I had a file of evidence against him. He needs to know exactly what I have, where I'm keeping it, and if I've given it to the authorities yet. He sent Chloe to play the victim, hoping I'd lower my guard and tell her my hand. I smiled. It felt like ice cracking. So I'm going to give her exactly what she wants. We pulled into the parking lot of the diner. I walked in alone, leaving Marcus in the car. Chloe was sitting in a back booth, wearing oversized sunglasses and a baggy sweater, looking appropriately terrified. When she saw me, she reached across the table, trying to grab my hands. I pulled back, sliding into the booth opposite her. "Eleanor, thank God," she whispered. "Save the tears, Chloe," I said briskly. "You have about 3 minutes before I lose my patience. What do you want?" She sniffled, wiping a dry eye beneath her sunglasses. "I told you, I want out. I'll give you my parents on a silver platter, but I need to know we have a solid case. My dad is slippery. If you don't have hard proof, he'll destroy us both. What exactly did you find in his briefcase?" There it was, the probe. I leaned forward, lowering my voice, projecting a mixture of desperation and maternal panic. "I photographed his ledgers. I have the account numbers for the shell companies. But Chloe, I haven't gone to the police yet." Chloe's shoulders visibly relaxed. Just a fraction of an inch, but I caught it. "You haven't?" "No, because Arthur's signatures are on everything. If I go to the FBI, my son goes to prison." I let a single calculated tear slip down my cheek. "I can't lose my son, Chloe. I don't care about the money anymore. I just want Arthur safe." "Oh, Eleanor," Chloe cooed, her fake sympathy returning in full force. "I have the physical photographs, the USB drive with the offshore data, and the original deed to the house in a safe deposit box at my bank." I lied smoothly. "I'm willing to make a trade. Tell your father I will come to the notary office tomorrow at 2 p.m. I will hand over the flash drive and the evidence. I will even sign the quitclaim deed willingly so the house sale is completely legal." Chloe's eyes widened behind her sunglasses. "You would do that?" "On one condition," I said, my voice hardening. "Richard has to sign a legally binding confession, drafted by my attorney, stating that he coerced Arthur into signing the medical proxy and the wire transfers without Arthur's knowledge. I want my son completely exonerated. If Richard signs it, he gets the evidence, he gets the house, and he can walk away." Chloe stared at me, her mind clearly racing. She was calculating the odds. Richard would love this deal. He would get the house legally, without fear of me contesting the sale later, and he would get his hands on my evidence. And as for the written confession, Richard would sign it, take my evidence, and then destroy the confession the moment he walked out the door. He thought he was playing 3D chess with a checkers player. "I'll tell him," Chloe said, standing up quickly. The terrified victim persona was instantly gone, replaced by the brisk efficiency of a criminal with a deadline. I watched her walk out of the diner. I pulled out my burner phone and dialed Marcus, who was sitting in the car outside. "The bait is in the water," I said. "Call Adult Protective Services. And Marcus, call your friends at the FBI White Collar Division. Tell them to clear their schedules for tomorrow afternoon." The next day at 1:45 p.m., I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled lobby of the downtown notary and escrow office. I was wearing my sharpest suit. My posture was impeccably straight. I held a thick manila envelope in my left hand. Marcus walked beside me, carrying his own leather briefcase. We entered Conference Room B. Richard Sterling was already there, sitting at the head of the long mahogany table like a king holding court. Patricia sat to his right, wearing a smug, self-satisfied smile. Chloe sat next to her, no longer pretending to be a victim, her arms crossed arrogantly. And then there was Arthur. My heart broke looking at my son. He sat at the far end of the table, looking incredibly small. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale. When I walked in, he looked up, flinching as if expecting a blow. "Mom," he whispered. I'm so sorry." "Quiet, Arthur," Richard snapped, not even looking at him. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at the envelope in my hand. "Eleanor, I'm glad you finally decided to see reason. Dementia is a terrible disease, but I'm glad you have moments of clarity." "Cut the theatrics, Richard," I said, dropping the envelope onto the table. "We both know there's no dementia. There's just a man who steals from widows." Richard's smile didn't waver. He looked at Marcus. "And who is this? Your keeper?" "Marcus Thorne, Eleanor's legal counsel," Marcus said coldly. "We have the documents you requested. The photographic evidence of your wire fraud, the data on Sterling Future Tech LLC, and Eleanor's willingness to legally sign the deed over to you." Marcus pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. "In exchange for your signature on this sworn affidavit, admitting that Arthur Vance was manipulated and holds no criminal liability for your financial crimes." Richard laughed. It was a booming, arrogant sound. He picked up the affidavit, skimmed it, and pulled a Mont Blanc pen from his pocket. He scrawled his signature across the bottom without a second thought. He didn't care. He was going to take the house, take the money, and probably burn the affidavit the second the closing was finished. "There," Richard said, sliding the paper back to Marcus. "Now give me the envelope, Eleanor. The buyers are waiting in the next room to sign the final purchase agreement." I placed my hand firmly over the manila envelope. "Arthur," I said, looking directly at my son, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Look at Chloe." Arthur blinked, confused, and looked at his wife. "She is not pregnant, Arthur," I said gently. "She never was. She has a medical condition that makes it impossible. They bought fake ultrasounds online to trap you into a marriage, so Richard could get access to my assets." Arthur stared at Chloe. "What? Chloe, what is she saying?" Chloe rolled her eyes, dropping the sweet wife act entirely. "Oh, grow up, Arthur. You really thought a woman like me would settle for a burned-out code monkey? You were a mark, an easy target. Dad needed capital, and you had a rich, naive mother with a paid-off house." Arthur looked as if he had been physically struck. He literally gasped for air, clutching the edge of the table. The illusion, the gaslighting, the marriage, the baby, the supposed insanity of his mother, all of it shattered into a million jagged pieces in his mind. You lied to me," Arthur choked out, tears spilling over his lashes. "You made me lock my own mother in a shed." "We did you a favor, kid," Richard sneered, pulling the envelope from under my hand. "You were too weak to take what was yours. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a house to sell." Richard eagerly ripped open the manila envelope. He reached inside and pulled out the contents. He froze. There were no USB drives. There were no photographs of his ledgers. Instead, he held a stack of blank printer paper, and on top of the stack was a single photograph of my late sister, Grace, smiling brightly. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "Where is the evidence, Eleanor? Are you playing games with me?" "I don't play games, Richard," I said softly. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. 4 men and 2 women walked in, wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back. Behind them stood a stern-looking woman with an ID badge that read Adult Protective Services. "Richard Sterling," the lead FBI agent said, stepping up to the table. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder financial abuse. Patricia Sterling and Chloe Sterling, you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." Richard dropped the blank papers. The arrogant investment banker vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating old man. "This is a mistake. You have no proof. She's crazy." "Actually, Richard," Marcus said, tapping his briefcase, "while you were busy gloating and explaining your entire plot to a room full of people, you failed to notice that my briefcase has a rather high-end recording device built into the handle. You just confessed to wire fraud, coercion, and extortion on tape." Patricia began to scream as an agent placed handcuffs on her wrists. Chloe burst into genuine ugly tears, begging the agents, screaming that it was all her father's idea. As the FBI agents led the Sterlings out of the room in handcuffs, reading them their Miranda rights, the silence they left behind was deafening. I turned to Arthur. He was still sitting at the table, his face buried in his arms, sobbing with a depth of sorrow that broke my heart all over again. I walked over to him, pulled a chair close, and wrapped my arms around his shaking shoulders. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't yell. I just held my son while the ruins of his life fell down around him. The recovery was not easy. It didn't happen overnight. With Marcus's help, the FBI was able to freeze Richard's offshore accounts before the money could be dispersed. It took 6 months of agonizing legal battles, but I got my retirement funds back. Richard and Patricia were denied bail. They pled guilty to avoid a drawn-out trial and were sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Chloe, who rolled on her parents to save herself, received 3 years of probation and a lifetime of ruined credit. Arthur filed for annulment the very next day. The burnout and the psychological abuse he had suffered at the hands of the Sterlings left deep scars. He moved into a small, quiet apartment across town and started intensive trauma therapy twice a week. He is learning to set boundaries, to stand up for himself, and to recognize the signs of manipulation. Our relationship is fragile, like spun glass, but every Sunday he comes to my house for dinner, and we carefully, lovingly, rebuild the trust between us. As for me, I moved back into my home on Maplewood Drive. I threw away the cheap folding cot from the shed. I painted the walls of my living room a warm, buttery yellow, and I hung the silver-framed photograph of my husband right back on the mantel where it belonged. Society tells women my age that we are supposed to fade into the background. They tell us that when our spouses die or our children leave, our usefulness is over. They expect us to be quiet, to be compliant, and to politely step aside so others can take what we have built. They are wrong. Age does not make us weak. It makes us lethal. We have survived decades of heartbreak, of career battles, of raising families and burying loved ones. We have an arsenal of wisdom and an intuition honed by time. If someone ever tries to make you feel invisible in your own life, if they try to gaslight you into doubting your own mind, or if they try to push you out of the home you built with your own 2 hands, do not weep, do not fold. Audit them, expose them, and remind them that a woman who has survived a lifetime of storms does not bow to a gentle breeze.